On a cold Tuesday morning in February in a town called Harlan's Bluff, Kentucky, a 53-year-old woman sat at the kitchen table of a house that was no longer hers and counted what she had left. $212. A cracked phone with a cracked screen. A suitcase she hadn't fully unpacked because some part of her had kept believing, right up until she stopped believing, that things would turn around. Her name was Vera Calloway. And 3 weeks earlier, after 31 years of marriage, her husband Merritt had handed her a set of divorce papers across that same kitchen table. And she had signed them because she was too tired to fight, and because the lawyer they couldn't afford had told her that fighting would only cost more than she had. Merritt kept the house. Merritt kept the truck. Merritt kept the savings account that turned out to have very little in it, because Merritt had a talent for spending money in ways that Vera had never been invited to see. What Vera got was the older car with the bad transmission, the suitcase, and a letter from her late uncle's estate attorney in Calder Hollow, Tennessee, informing her that she had inherited the Calloway millworks. She had to read the letter twice, not because she didn't understand the words, but because she understood them too well. The Calloway millworks. Her great-uncle Doss Calloway had run that mill for most of his adult life. A sawmill, out on the edge of a holler, on land that had been in the family since before Vera's grandmother was born. Doss had died 6 weeks before the divorce papers arrived, quiet and alone the way he had lived. Vera had attended the funeral. She had stood at the graveside in the November wind and thought mostly about the drive back, about how cold the car was, about how Merritt hadn't come with her because he said he had things to do. She had not thought about the mill. She had not thought about what Doss might leave behind. He had never married, had no children. The mill, as far as Vera knew, was a falling-down building on flood-prone land with a rusted waterwheel that hadn't turned in 20 years. She had driven past it once as a child and thought it looked like something from a photograph of another century. The estate attorney's letter said the property had been assessed by the county. The assessed value was listed at the bottom of the page, just above the attorney's signature, in plain black type, $0. Vera set the letter down. She picked up her phone and looked at the $212 in her account. Then she picked the letter back up and read it one more time, because sometimes a number looks different the second time you look at it. It did not look different. It was still 0. She had nowhere else to go. Her daughter Pam was in Nashville with 2 kids and a small apartment. Her sister had a spare room but also a husband who made Vera feel like a problem to be managed. The motel at the edge of Harlan's Bluff charged $60 a night, which meant she had 3 nights before the math ran out. So she drove to Calder Hollow, Tennessee. It took 4 hours in the bad transmission car, and she had to stop twice because the engine ran hot, and she sat at a gas station outside of Crossville, eating a pack of crackers she'd brought from home, watching the heat gauge drop, and thinking that this was what 53 looked like when you had spent 31 years building someone else's future instead of your own. She arrived in Calder Hollow in the late afternoon. The town was smaller than she remembered from childhood visits. One main street, a post office, a hardware store, a diner with a hand-lettered sign. The attorney's office was above the feed supply, up a narrow stair that smelled of cedar and old paper. His name was Elton Pruitt, past 65, with the kind of quiet patience you earn from spending a lifetime around grief and paperwork. He walked her through the documents. The mill property. 4 acres on the Caney Fork, including the main millhouse, a storage barn, and what the records called a secondary structure. The waterwheel had not operated since 1998. The roof of the main building had 2 significant failures. The county had been carrying the tax burden on a courtesy deferral, because, Pruitt said, there had been some question about what the property actually was. Vera asked what he meant by that. Pruitt folded his hands on the desk. He said Doss had done something unusual with the property about 15 years back, and that she might want to see it herself before she made any decisions. He handed her the keys and a hand-drawn map on a piece of notebook paper, the lines drawn in the careful hand of an old man who trusted nothing he couldn't put on paper himself. She drove out the next morning. The road to the mill was gravel, then dirt, then more of a suggestion than a road. The trees closed in on both sides, oak and tulip poplar just starting to bud in the February cold, and the sound of the creek came to her before she saw it. She smelled the water first, cold stone, wet leaves, and something underneath it. Wood smoke and sawdust, the ghost of a working place. When she stepped out of the car and looked at the Calloway millworks, She felt a familiar feeling settle in her chest. The feeling of being handed something broken, and being expected to be grateful. The mill house leaned slightly toward the creek, its siding silver gray, gaps in the boards where the weather had taken its toll. The waterwheel sat still and rusted on the side of the building, half its paddles rotted off. The barn behind it had a caved-in section at one corner. Kudzu was beginning its slow takeover of the fence line. The whole property, to the eye of a woman who had spent 30 years calculating whether things were worth saving or worth letting go, looked like something the county should have taken back a long time ago. But then she noticed what she had not noticed at first. The path from the road to the millhouse door had been swept recently. Not cleaned. It was still a dirt path, but swept, brushed, clear of leaves and debris by someone who cared whether you could walk it without tripping. The door had a new padlock, the only new thing visible on the whole property. And on the side of the millhouse, mounted at eye level, was a small wooden board under a piece of plexiglass, and on it in block letters, hand-painted and faded but still legible, were the words: Canny Fork, Repair Shop, all welcome. No charge. Vera stood in front of that sign for a long time. She went back to see Pruitt. She asked him what the sign meant. He told her to come in and sit down, and he told her about Doss. What he told her took the better part of an hour, and by the end of it, Vera Calloway understood that she had inherited something she could not have put a price on with any instrument she owned. Doss Calloway had not been, as the family broadly understood him, a solitary man who couldn't be bothered with people. He had been a man who had found one specific way to be useful, and had practiced it for the last 20 years of his life, without once drawing attention to himself. The mill hadn't run lumber since the 90s, but the equipment inside it, the lathes, the bandsaws, the hand tools accumulated over a century of Calloway woodworking, Doss had never sold. He had opened the doors instead. 3 days a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, the Calloway Millworks had been what that sign said, a free community repair shop. Anybody in Calder Hollow who had something broken and couldn't afford to fix it or replace it could bring it to Doss. A chair with a busted leg, a porch railing gone soft, a child's bed frame that had cracked down the middle. Doss fixed it, or he showed you how to fix it, or he handed you the tool and stood beside you while you figured it out yourself. He charged nothing. He turned no one away. He had a particular way with the older people in the hollow, Pruitt said, and with kids who came in after school, wanting to learn how to make something with their hands. He had taught more than 40 years' worth of people how to use a hand plane and a chisel and how to read the grain of a piece of wood before you cut it. Vera sat in that chair above the feed supply and thought about the winters her family had struggled to buy Christmas presents, while her great-uncle Doss was down in a holler in Tennessee, running a free wood shop out of a rusting mill. She thought about all the family dinners where someone would mention old Doss and his funny little mill. The way you mention someone who has made an odd choice, and you've quietly agreed not to judge him for it. She thought about the assessed value printed at the bottom of the letter. $0. She drove back out to the mill that afternoon and unlocked the new padlock. Inside, the mill house was dim and smelled of wood shavings and machine oil and the faint damp of old timber. But the tools were clean, every one of them, hung on their proper hooks, edges oiled, surfaces wiped. The workbenches were worn smooth by use, stained with the history of 10,000 small repairs, but solid. Someone had loved these tools and these benches with the daily attention of a person who understands that a well-kept tool is a kind of promise. Against the far wall, she found the shelves. There were dozens of them. Not one large shelf, but many small ones, each bracket carefully mounted, each shelf level. And on the shelves were things left behind after repairs, little notes, cards, objects, drawings. A child's crayon drawing of a chair with the words, "My chair is fixed," taped to the shelf above where the chair had presumably sat. A postcard from somewhere in Ohio that said, "Mr. Doss, the rocking chair made it the whole trip. Mama sat in it every day until she passed. Thank you." A photograph of a man and woman at what looked like a 50th anniversary dinner, and on the back in pencil, "The table you fixed held up just fine." The Hargrove family. There were thank you notes in children's handwriting. There were notes in shaky old person hands. There was a small American flag folded into a triangle with a strip of masking tape on which someone had written in marker,
"For Doss."
"He fixed the cabinet where we kept Earl's things." Vera stood in front of those shelves for a very long time. She was still standing there when she heard gravel crunch outside, and the door opened, and a boy of about 14 came in. He stopped when he saw her, He had the look of someone who had been coming to a place without expecting to find a stranger in it. His name was Cleet. She learned that in the next few minutes, in the halting way you learn things from a teenager who isn't sure whether to stay or go. He lived up the road. He'd been coming to the mill for 2 years. Doss had been teaching him to make furniture. He asked if the shop was closed now. Vera looked around the dim millhouse, at the clean tools and the worn benches and the shelves full of thank you notes, and she said she didn't know yet. Clayton nodded. He turned to leave. Then he turned back and said, in the way of someone who has been holding something for a while and decides to set it down. Doss had been teaching him to make a hope chest for his mom. She was sick. Nothing fatal, he said quickly, but the kind of sick that doesn't go away, that just changes your life around it. And Doss had said that a handmade thing holds something a bought thing doesn't, and that his mom would know the difference. The chest was half finished. He'd left it in the barn. He left. Vera stood alone in the mill house. She did not sleep well that night at the motel in town. She lay on the thin mattress and thought about the half-finished hope chest in the barn, and the flag folded in a triangle, and the postcard from Ohio, and the small fact that a man her family had quietly considered a little odd had spent 20 years doing something so particular and so unglamorous that no one had noticed it was extraordinary until he was dead. She thought about the 0 on the assessment. She thought about the $212. She thought about Merritt keeping the house and the truck and 31 years of a life she had helped build. And she thought about something Pruitt had said as she was leaving his office. He had said, almost as an aside, that Doss had come to see him about 12 years ago. That Doss had done something with the property that Pruitt described as unusual but not unheard of. That he'd asked her to come back in the morning before she made any decisions because there was another document she hadn't seen yet. Now, before we tell you about that document, and we promise you, it is the piece of this story that changes everything. If you've made it this far and this story means something to you, take 10 seconds and subscribe to Giant Stories. Leave us a comment telling us where you're watching from. It tells us these stories are worth telling now. Let's get back to Vera. She was back in Pruitt's office at 9 the next morning. He had a folder waiting for her on the desk. He opened it and slid a document across to her. It was notarized, 12 years old, recorded at the county courthouse, and the heading at the top read, Declaration of Community Use. Calloway Millworks Property, Caney Fork Township. Vera did not understand all of it, but one paragraph she read 3 times until it stayed. The paragraph said that Doss Calloway, in his capacity as sole owner of the Calloway Millworks property, had voluntarily placed the millhouse building and its contents under a permanent deed restriction for community craft and repair use. The land could revert to heirs, but the millhouse and its tools, the working heart of the place, could not be sold separately, converted to commercial use, or closed to community access as long as the structure stood. It was bound by the declaration to its purpose, in perpetuity, unless the entire property were demolished, which would require a county process that Pruitt said, quietly but firmly, had very specific requirements for properties of historical designation, which the Calloway Millworks, it turned out, had been awarded in 2009. Without anyone in the family knowing, because Doss had not seen any reason to mention it. Vera looked up. She asked Pruitt why Doss had done all of this without telling anyone. Pruitt took off his glasses and looked at her in the way of a man who has had this conversation before, not with her, but with others in her position. He said Doss had told him, that afternoon 12 years ago, that he had a simple worry. He had seen what happened to places like his, when the person holding them together was gone. He had watched the mills and the workshops and the community spaces in 3 counties get sold off and converted and paved over. Not because anyone wanted to destroy them, but because when the person who cared was gone, the people who came next didn't always know what they were holding. And he didn't want to put that burden on anyone in the family alone. He wanted the law to hold it, so that whoever came next could say no to the wrong thing without having to be the one who said no. Vera sat with that for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since the night before. She asked if there had been anyone who had tried to buy the property. Pruitt nodded slowly. He said that about 8 months ago, while Doss was still alive but toward the end, a development group out of Knoxville had made contact. They were building a resort corridor along the creek, high-end cabins, private fishing access. The Calloway Millworks sat on what they considered a key piece of riverfront. They had made an offer. Doss had not told the family because, Pruitt said, Doss knew the family would have told him to take it. The offer had been $90,000. Vera sat very still. She thought about the suitcase in the motel room. She thought about $212. She thought about $90,000 and what it would have meant for her in this exact moment of her life. And she understood with a clarity that was almost physical why Doss had not told anyone. Because he knew. He knew that if it came to a vote, need would win over purpose, and need was something the family had plenty of. He had not told them because he had already made the decision that the family's need, real as it was, did not give anyone the right to sell what already belonged to the Hollow. The development group was still interested. Pruitt told her this gently, carefully, watching her face. They had renewed contact after Doss died, once the estate became a matter of public record. They had a new representative. His name was Garrison Webb. He had already called Pruitt's office twice, and 3 days later, Garrison Webb showed up at the mill. He drove a silver SUV that had never been on a dirt road before, and handled the last quarter mile to the millworks with visible reluctance. He was about 45, well-dressed in the way of men who want to seem approachable while leaving no doubt they have money. He had a folder under his arm and a smile that had been calibrated to put people at ease. He complimented the property. He called it charming. He said words like potential and vision and natural asset. He said the resort corridor would bring jobs to Calder Hollow, investment, infrastructure. He said it with the fluency of a man who has said these things in every county in the state, and found them to be true often enough not to examine them too closely. Then he set the folder on the workbench and opened it. $110,000. He said it was a significant increase from the previous offer, which he acknowledged had not been properly communicated to the right person. He looked at Vera with the practiced empathy of a man who has learned that widows and divorcees are often more practical than they appear, once the number is large enough. Vera looked at the folder. She looked at the number. She thought about her daughter in Nashville, and the cracked phone and the bad transmission and the motel room and all of it, and she was quiet for long enough that Webb took it as a good sign, and began explaining the timeline. Then, Cleet walked in. He came in the way he apparently always came in, through the side door, without knocking, the way you enter a place you've been entering for 2 years, and consider more or less yours. He stopped when he saw Webb. He looked at the folder on the workbench. He looked at Vera. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with the eyes of a 14-year-old who has already had enough things taken away, that he knows what the beginning of another loss looks like. Vera closed the folder. She pushed it back across the workbench toward Garrison Webb. She said she needed time to think. Webb nodded pleasantly and said of course, and left a card, and said he hoped she'd see that the offer was a generous one. He drove away and the silver SUV threw up a thin spray of gravel as it went. Vera stood alone in the millhouse for a long time after he left. She thought of the right thing to do and the practical thing to do. And for the first time in recent memory, those two things were pointing in different directions, and she was not sure she had the luxury to choose the right one. She had signed divorce papers because she was too tired to fight. She had let Merritt keep the house because her lawyer said fighting would cost more than it was worth. She had been making the practical choice for 31 years, and she had arrived at 53 in a motel in Calder Hollow, Tennessee, with $200 and a car that ran hot. The practical choice had a long record, and it was not a good one. That evening she walked the property alone. She walked to the creek and stood where the water ran fast over the limestone shelf, and she thought about the flag folded in a triangle, and the postcard from Ohio and Cleet's mother, who was the kind of sick that doesn't go away. She thought about Doss spending 20 years in this mill, learning the name of every broken thing anyone brought to him, fixes it, and asking for nothing. She thought about what it must have cost him. Not money, but something else, the daily choice to show up to something no one would notice until he was gone. She thought about the declaration Doss had filed at the county courthouse 12 years ago, with no fanfare, no announcement, in the handwriting of a man who wanted to lock a door before the wrong person found the key. He had seen Webb coming. Not Webb specifically, but the type. He had known that someone would come with a folder and a number, and he had wanted the person who came after him to be able to say no, without having to be strong enough to say it alone. He wanted the law to carry it, Pruitt had said, so she wouldn't have to carry it by herself. Vera went back inside the millhouse and sat at one of the worn workbenches. There was a half-made cabinet in the corner, something Doss had been working on. The joints were cut but not fitted, the pieces lying separate, waiting. She picked up one side panel and turned it in her hands. Even unfinished, the wood was beautiful. Cherry, she thought, or maybe walnut. She didn't know enough to be certain. But the grain was even and the cut was clean, and you could see that whoever made this had cared about the wood itself, not just the thing it was going to become. She set it down. She picked up a chisel from the rack beside the bench, turned it in her hand and set it back. Then she went back to the motel and called Pruitt. In the morning, she drove to the County Historical Preservation Office, because Pruitt had told her that the historical designation of 2009 came with a specific set of protections that had never been fully explored, since Doss hadn't seen any need to explore them while he was alive and keeping the place himself. The woman at the preservation office was named Sandra, 50s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, the air of someone who had spent a career doing important work that nobody funded properly. She pulled the Calloway Millworks file without being asked, which told Vera the file was not a stranger to her desk. The millworks, Sandra explained, had been designated as a heritage craft site under the state's Rural Preservation Program. That designation, combined with the community use declaration Doss had filed, created what she called an interlocking protection. The historical status meant no demolition without a public review process. The community use declaration meant no commercial conversion. Together, they meant that what Garrison Webb was proposing to do was not simply a matter of Vera saying yes or no. It was a matter of what the law allowed. And the law, as Doss had spent 12 years quietly arranging it, did not allow it. Sandra looked at Vera over her reading glasses and said that frankly, in her 22 years at that office, she had never seen a private citizen take such deliberate care to protect a community asset from future sale. She said it with a particular kind of admiration, the admiration of someone who understands how difficult it is to protect a thing from the people who love it, but need money more than they understand what they have. Vera sat in that office and thought about Doss eating alone in the Hollow for 20 years, while the family had dinners where they mentioned him in passing. That funny old man with his mill. She thought about him walking into Pruitt's office 12 years ago and saying simply that he wanted to make sure no one could undo what he had built, even if the person who inherited it needed money badly enough to want to. He had known. He had known exactly what kind of position his heir would be in, and he had made sure she had something to stand on. Webb came back the following week, this time with a lawyer. He was still pleasant, but the pleasantness had acquired an undertone. He talked about fair market value and the limitations of historical designations and the possibility of a legal challenge to the community use declaration, which his lawyer described as potentially overreachable, a word he said smoothly enough that it almost didn't sound like a threat. Vera waited for him to finish. Then she set two documents on the workbench. The notarized community use declaration, 12 years old, county recorded. The heritage craft site designation, stamped by the State Preservation Office. She set them side by side and waited. Webb's lawyer picked them up. He read them. He read them again. He said something quietly to Webb that Vera couldn't hear, and she watched the pleasant expression on Webb's face do what pleasant expressions do when the math stops working. He tried a few more angles because men like him don't stop easily. He talked about amendments and exceptions. He suggested that perhaps the land trust holding the community use declaration might be open to a discussion about modernizing the terms. He said it the way people say things when they know the answer is no but have not yet accepted it. Vera said that Doss had not left the declaration to a land trust. He had left it to the County Historical Commission, which had accepted it as a permanent condition of the heritage designation. There was no one to call. There was no amendment process. The door had been built into the wall. Webb looked around the millhouse. He looked at the worn benches and the clean tools and the shelves of thank you notes. He looked at Clet, who had appeared again in the doorway the way he always appeared, with the particular radar of a teenager who senses when something important is being decided in a place that matters to him. And she saw Webb try, one last time, to appraise it, to find the number that made sense of why a woman with nothing would refuse the thing that would solve everything. He couldn't find it, because it wasn't a number. He picked up his folder. He thanked her for her time, with the chill of someone who has decided that politeness is the only option remaining. He walked out to the silver SUV, and the SUV went down the dirt road and turned onto the gravel, and then the sound of it was gone, and there was nothing left but the creak and the birds and the smell of old wood and machine oil. Cleet looked at Vera. He said, in the way of someone who isn't sure he has the right to ask, "Does this mean the shop is staying open?" She looked at the worn benches. She looked at the clean tools on their hooks. She looked at the shelves, at the crayon drawing and the folded flag and the postcard from Ohio. She said she supposed it did. She did not make that decision out of nobility. Let her be clear about that, because Doss would not have wanted it dressed up into something bigger than it was. She made it because she had done the math, and the math, for once, had come out different from how she expected. $110,000 would solve the next 2 or 3 years. Keeping the mill would not make her rich, would not fix the car transmission, would not undo 31 years of building a life that fell over when she stopped holding it up. But Pruitt had told her about a small grants program through the State Craft Council for heritage sites in active community use. He had told her that the county had, on 3 occasions, contributed maintenance funds to designated properties that demonstrated community impact. He had told her that 2 of the families whose members had learned woodworking from Doss had already asked, through Pruitt, whether there was anything they could do to help keep the place running. He had also told her that Doss, in the last year of his life, had been approached by a community college in the next county about a formal apprenticeship partnership, that the conversation had been interrupted by his illness, but that the contact person at the college was still interested. Doss had not built a mill. He had built, over 20 years, the conditions under which the mill could survive without him. He had not trusted any single person to carry it, including her. He had built it into the structure of the thing itself, into the law and the designation, and the slow accumulation of people who had learned something there, and would not easily let it go. She stayed in Calder Hollow. She moved into the old farmhouse on the property which needed work but was livable if you were not particular about drafts. She was not particular about drafts. She had been cold before. In the first weeks, she learned to open the millhouse at 8 on Tuesday mornings, and to make coffee strong enough to smell from the road. People came back. Some of them came back cautiously, the way people return to a place they're not sure will still be there, testing it with 1 foot before committing the rest of themselves. An older man named Bernard, who had been coming since his wife died 3 years ago, who said the millhouse was the only place he went that didn't feel like waiting. A woman with 2 kids who wanted to learn to build raised garden beds for the yard of the rental they couldn't afford to improve, but had to live in. A teenage girl who came in silent the first time and by the 3rd visit was asking specific questions about dovetail joints. Cleet came every week. The hope chest was finished in March, in time for his mother's birthday. Vera helped him sand the final coat. It was good work, better than she could have done, and she told him so honestly. He carried it home on a borrowed dolly. He came back the following Tuesday and told her his mother had cried. He said it with the particular combination of pride and embarrassment that belongs to 14-year-old boys, whose mothers cry over things they made with their hands. Vera began keeping a record. Not because anyone told her to, not because she had a system for it, but because one afternoon she was standing at the shelves and looking at the notes and the drawings and the flag, and she understood that what she was looking at was 40 years of proof that the mill had mattered, and that the only reason anyone knew it had mattered was because the people it mattered to had left something behind to say so. She bought a composition notebook, the kind with the black and white, marbled cover. She wrote the date at the top of the first page. Below it she wrote the names of the people who had come in that week, what they'd brought, what they'd made or fixed or learned. She wrote it in the plain way, no flourishes, the way you keep a record when you want it to last and not to impress. She found Doss's own notebooks in the barn. Not the formal records, but the working ones, the ones where he had written down joinery techniques and lumber grades, and the names of people he had promised to follow up with. She read them the way you read someone's handwriting when they are no longer there to explain themselves. Slowly, with the feeling that you are being led into a room you were not previously allowed in, she found a page where he had written, in a margin, unconnected to anything else on the page, "The only thing that outlasts a person is what they taught someone else to do." She read it 3 times. Then she wrote it on a piece of cardstock and tacked it above the main workbench, where it hung for the rest of the time she ran the mill. Not because it was wise, which it was, because it was true, which is different. The community college partnership came through in the fall. 2 afternoons a week, Students from the woodworking program began coming to the millworks for what the college called applied heritage practice, and what Vera called learning to fix things. The instructor was a compact, exacting woman named Price, who wore her hair in a braid, and had the patience of someone who had made peace with the fact that young people learn slowly and forget fast, and come back for the same lesson 3 times before it sticks. Vera watched Price teach a class of 8 students how to cut a mortise and tenon joint, and she thought about Doss doing the same thing in the same room. And she thought about how a room can hold a practice across the generations, the way a church holds a faith. Not in the walls, but in the people who keep coming back to it. She was not the same woman who had driven to Calder Hollow with a suitcase and $200. She was not wealthier, not in the way that would have mattered to Garrison Webb. The car still ran hot. The farmhouse still had drafts. She had taken on some contract work, bookkeeping for 3 small businesses in town, enough to cover the basics. She had applied for 2 of the grants Pruitt had mentioned, and 1 had come through. But there was something else. Something she could not have named when she arrived, and which she could still only name imperfectly now. A sense of standing inside something that was larger than herself, something that would continue after her, something that asked her not to build it, but only to keep it from falling. It was not the life she had planned. She was 53 years old, divorced, living in a drafty farmhouse in a Tennessee holler, making coffee at 8 in the morning for people who came to fix broken things. She had not planned any of it. But she had learned over the course of that year that some things are not given to you because you plan for them. Some things are given to you because someone else a long time ago looked at who was coming next and decided to build them a place to stand. Doss had never told her. He had never said, "Vera, I'm building this for you, for the day when you'll have nothing else." He had not said it because to say it would have made it a debt, and Doss Calloway had not believed in debts. He had believed in doors left open. She found the last thing in December, going through the final box from the barn. It was a letter, unsealed, addressed to no one, written on the back of a lumber receipt in Doss's square handwriting. It said, "If you're reading this, you're the one who came after. I don't know what you're carrying. I expect it's heavy. The mill won't make you rich. Nothing I did here was ever about that. But there are people in this hollow who know how to make something with their hands because of what happened in this building. And that doesn't stop being true just because I'm gone. Keep the doors open. Let people bring what's broken. You don't have to know how to fix everything. You just have to be willing to try." Doss, she sat in the barn for a long time with that letter. The December cold came through the walls, and she did not get up to go inside. She sat with it the way you sit with something that changes the shape of what you thought you knew about a person. She had thought Doss was the odd one. The one who had made a peculiar choice and lived out a quiet, eccentric life at the edge of the family's notice. She had not known, because he had not told her, that he had been paying attention all along. That he had known, somehow, that someone in the family would one day need a place to land that was not about money. That he had made the landing himself carefully, without ceremony. 12 years before she needed it. She folded the letter. She went back into the millhouse. She turned on the lights. She opened the composition notebook to a new page. She wrote the date, she wrote the names, she kept the doors open. And every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday morning, when the gravel crunched outside and someone came in carrying something broken, Vera Calloway put down whatever she was doing and went to see what could be fixed. Not because she was trying to be Doss. She wasn't Doss. She was a 53-year-old bookkeeper from Harlan's Bluff, Kentucky, who had arrived in a hollow in Tennessee with $200 and a suitcase, and found, inside a falling-down mill, evidence that someone had been quietly deciding, for 20 years, that the people who needed a place would have one. That was the inheritance. Not the land, not the building, not the waterwheel that still hadn't turned in 20 years. The inheritance was this: proof that one person, working without recognition in a building no appraiser could value, had changed the course of enough lives that the changing kept going, past his death and into the hands of a woman who had arrived with nothing, and found that nothing, it turned out, was not what she had.